A memorable night in boxing history. Two future Hall of Famers collide for middleweight supremacy at Madison Square Garden, September 29, 2001. Only 18 days after 9/11, the first major boxing event after that terrible and tragic event, as the country tries to heal with a little boxing therapy. Welcome to Scorecard Legends, Trinidad versus Hopkins. Welcome to Scorecard Legends. I'll be your host tonight, Cigar Boxing. This is my offering to my channel. Recently, I've been thinking of ways to bring more positivity to the boxing culture on YouTube and just inform fans who don't know about these historical boxing matches and give us something to talk about and converse. This is my new offering to the YouTube community. Before I get started, let's talk about why this fight is so important. The reason this fight is important is this fight was for the undisputed middleweight championship of the world. Since 2001, before 2001, the last undisputed middleweight champion was Marvelous Marvin Hagler in 1987. So there was a 14-year gap since we've had an undisputed middleweight champion. Let's take a look at what it takes to become undisputed champion. At this time, you had to have 3 out of the 4 major sanctioned body belts to be declared undisputed. After 2007, that changed in saying now that you had to have all 4 major sanctioned body belts. Let me add that with this recent year with Terrence Crawford having all 4 major sanctioned body belts at 140 pounds, he's the only other boxer in boxing history to do it, besides Bernard Hopkins. So that is monumental in itself. But not only that, Bernard Hopkins was undisputed for 4 years. That's almost unheard of. Before that, Marvelous Marvin Hagler was undisputed for 7 years. Something to look at and something to be said about that. Right now in boxing with so many belts, it's unclear as a regular fan, a casual fan, who the champion is. Unlike in MMA, there's only 1 belt. In boxing, there's 4, almost 5 major sanctioned body belts if you include the IBO. So let's look at the backstory and build up to what happened in Madison Square Garden on September 29, 2001. In 2001, early, there was a round-robin middleweight tournament set up by Don King. This round-robin tournament included the WBC middleweight champion in Keith Holmes, the long-reigning IBF champion in Bernard the Executioner Hopkins, and the WBA middleweight champion in William Joppy, with a new addition to the round-robin tournament, Felix Tito Trinidad, being a former belt holder at welterweight and junior welterweight, coming off a sensational 12th round knockout, or TKO, of Fernando Vargas and taking his WBA belt. The tournament is being set up with Tito Trinidad being the largest and the biggest star in this tournament. Also, I would argue to say at this time that Felix Trinidad was probably the biggest star in boxing below the heavyweight division. Please remember that Felix Trinidad came off a victory against David Reed, Oscar De La Hoya, and Fernando Vargas at this time. So, very, very big star. So the way the tournament was set up, Bernard Hopkins would put his belt on the line and Keith Holmes would put his belt on the line in September of 2001. That fight went on. It was a one-sided unanimous decision in favor of Bernard Hopkins. So he became a 2 belt holder in the middleweight division, where he had the IBF and the WBC middleweight championships. In May of 2001, there was a fight set up between William Joppy and Tito Trinidad. A lot of questions need to be answered in this fight. Could Tito get in the ring and deal with a real middleweight? He definitely answered that question in this fight. This fight was going, and then in the fourth round, William Joppy got knocked down and caught with a devastating left hook. William Joppy was able to get up and continue, but he still looked wobbly on his legs in the fifth round, and he got knocked down again until the referee stepped in and stopped the fight in the fifth round. A fabulous TKO by Tito Trinidad. So now, with both these fighters and their victories, there was to be a meeting or clash in the finals of this round robin tournament for all three belts on the line, the WBA, WBC, and IBF. The winner to be declared the undisputed middleweight champion of the world. The fight was signed September 15th, 2001. What's incredible about this fight is the fact that the press tour for this fight was very heated. They did a press junket in New York, but the most controversial one has to be the one that they did in Puerto Rico, with all the racist banter going back and forth between the two, with Bernard Hopkins talking the most, obviously. But I think the final moment and the final blow was when they were on the press tour in Puerto Rico and Bernard Hopkins threw down the Puerto Rican flag. How many of you remember this press conference? Look at this video. For some of us who are out there who are older uploaders and remember this fight in 2001, I'm talking to guys like me, Ghetto Superstar, Blood Boxing, Cornbread. We all remember this fight. The press conference, this is why this fight was getting heated. So as the fight got closer, 9/11 happened, so the fight had to be rescheduled. It had a 2-week hiatus, and it was set up then again for September 29th, 2001. For those of you who say that Felix Trinidad is a plumped up welterweight, I need you to remember that he progressed his way from welterweight into junior middleweight and then middleweight. The thing that I look at when I talk about Tito is Tito had one of the highest knockout streaks. He was knocking guys out, okay? I think at the time, this would be, before he stepped in the ring with Bernard Hopkins, I think he had 40 fights, okay? And I think 27 were by knockout at the time. And no, was it 27 or was it 36? I'm not sure. But he had a high knockout percentage and he was knocking guys out. I mean, this was incredible. You got to think that the only guy that he didn't knock out really was Oscar De La Hoya before that. You know, the other fights after that, he was knocking guys out. So even though Bernard Hopkins had been fighting at middleweight his whole career, he was not the favorite in this fight. Tito Trinidad was looked upon as Superman in this fight. Those of us who are boxing heads knew what was going to happen, but the senses of the general public, because Bernard Hopkins was virtually unknown at that time. So before the fight started, there was a hand wrap controversy, and there's not been a lot of clarification on the hand wrap controversy concerning Felix Trinidad. I'm going to break it down to you really quick. This hand wrap controversy with Felix Trinidad is very different from Antonio Margarito. Antonio Margarito, his hand wrap scandal is different because he had been believed to be using plaster of Paris on his hands. So basically hitting somebody with a cast on your hand in a boxing match against Miguel Cotto, where you have Felix Trinidad, and his issue is where the gauze and tape were placed on his hands. According to the New York State Athletic Commission, the way he wanted to place the gauze over his knuckles and the tape over his knuckles by the New York State Athletic Commission was not correct. So I'm not saying that he was trying to cheat. It's just depending on what state and what the rules are, you can't do certain things. Bernard Hopkins refused to come out of the dressing room and fight until that hand wrap controversy was done. So I think the gauze and the tape situation was handled. Okay. Not using plaster of Paris. Let's get that correct. Not using plaster of Paris. So the hand wrap scandal was taken care of and the fight started. As the fighters were coming to the ring, the crowd was emotional. You could hear them, waving the American flag, waving the Puerto Rican flag. There were a lot of firemen and a lot of policemen in the audience that night. That night, the card was really good simply because you got a chance to see the last fight of Ricardo El Finito Lopez, who was one of the best strawweights ever, man. Homeboy could fight, okay? But with that, the bell rung. And it was weird watching Bernard Hopkins with that temporary tattoo from Golden Palace on his back. Bernard Hopkins, from the get-go, you could tell that he wanted to use his jab and stay away from Tito Trinidad's left hook. You could tell that they worked on that in camp. And Tito Trinidad had a hard time because Bernard Hopkins was physically bigger than him. Bernard Hopkins was stronger than he was. But Bernard Hopkins, in the way he shifts and movement and he uses his head as a weapon, he started going in with his head a little bit, and even Tito Trinidad started complaining to the ref about him headbutting. So with that going on, the thing I started noticing is Bernard Hopkins started getting sharper and closer with his shots. He would make Trinidad miss, and he would come and hit him. Make Trinidad miss, hold him, and hit him again. As the fight continued on, you could tell that the strength, all the holding and weight that Bernard Hopkins was putting on Trinidad was taking its toll. By the 8th and 9th round, Tito Trinidad had slowed down. The crowd had gotten quieter. They weren't cheering Tito, Tito, Tito anymore. Then Bernard Hopkins started landing harder shots in the later rounds. And then I can tell that Trinidad was in trouble, especially in the 11th round. And, you know, Bernard Hopkins' legs were still fresh. Even listening to the fight and the biased commentary by George Foreman, I think that's why George Foreman got relieved of his duties after this fight and the commentating he did. He was even arguing on live television on the pay-per-view with Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant. How many of y'all remember that? But as it got to the 12th round, I could tell that Trinidad was exhausted. And as they were fighting in the middle of the ring, Bernard Hopkins caught him with like a perfect right, and he went down. And Tito's father stepped in the ring and waved the towel, and the fight was over. Bernard Hopkins had dropped down to the canvas, and he couldn't believe he had done it. He'd become the undisputed middleweight champion of the world. The thing about this fight, you know, some people, I don't necessarily like Bernard Hopkins' style, but you understand why he needs to be respected for doing this, because not many middleweights have done what he's done. But the thing about it is Bernard Hopkins had it hard as far as coming up. He was older. You got to remember, this was Bernard Hopkins' first major pay-per-view. He was 36 years old at the time of this fight. That's right. You heard me right. 36 years old. This is his first major pay-per-view. Before this, he was on Boxing After Dark. He had fought, you know, Roy Jones, but that wasn't pay-per-view. But yeah, Bernard Hopkins earned it. I don't have too much more to say about that night. I won a lot of money because I didn't think that Trinidad would be able to withstand Bernard Hopkins, because back then Bernard was much more craftier, much sharper than what he was in 2016 when he got knocked through those ropes. But how many of y'all remember that night? And tell me what you think of this fight. This is Scorecard Legends. This is what boxing is all about.